Hey guys, tonight we start with something practical. We're talking about jobs. Specifically, the very small, very exclusive list of epic jobs in ancient Rome that wouldn't completely destroy your body, your dignity, or your chances of waking up the next morning. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. If you imagine ancient Roman orgies as wild, spontaneous explosions of chaos where everyone just showed up and hoped for the best, congratulations. You've been misled by art, movies, and people who desperately want Rome to feel more exciting than it already was. In reality, Romans were obsessed with order. Even their excess had a clipboard. That's where the orgy planner comes in. This was not a participant. This was not someone living in the moment. This was an administrator, a logistics specialist, a person whose entire job was making sure that the richest, most powerful people in the city could indulge themselves without accidentally ruining their political careers. Because nothing kills a senatorial career faster than the wrong guest recognizing you at the wrong party. As an orgy planner, your responsibilities included guest lists, entertainment schedules, lighting, music, food service, pacing, and most importantly, separation of people who should absolutely not be in the same room together. You weren't managing pleasure, you were managing reputations, which in Rome were far more fragile than human life. You needed discretion, social intelligence, and the ability to leave a room at precisely the right moment. Stay too long, you become a liability. Leave too early, something goes wrong and suddenly everyone blames you. Timing was everything. Think wedding planner, but with senators, generals, and people who could legally have you disappeared. Here's the best part. You stayed clean indoors, dressed well, you weren't hauling stone, rowing ships, or wondering which limb would fall off first after a winter campaign. Your hands weren't calloused, your back wasn't broken. Your risk of being trampled by a horse was refreshingly low. Payment came in money, gifts, favors, protection, and future work, the holy trinity of Roman survival. Impress one household and suddenly you are recommended quietly, discreetly, with a nod. Which is Roman for your set? Morally questionable. Sure, physically exhausting, not even slightly. Socially dangerous, only if you talk too much, and that's the secret. You survive by knowing everything, and saying nothing. In ancient Rome, the smartest job wasn't the bravest or the strongest. It was the one where everyone trusted you, nobody noticed you, and absolutely no one wanted you dead. That alone puts orgy planner near the top of the career ladder. Ancient Rome had many luxury items. Fine wine, exotic animals, marble statues, and in a choice that says a lot about Roman priorities, human beings with dwarfism. If you were wealthy enough, owning a dwarf was considered fashionable, a living symbol that you had both money and questionable taste. And no, the dwarf seller was not the one being sold. That distinction matters a lot. The dwarf seller was a dealer, a broker, a man or woman who understood elite demand and knew exactly how to supply it without ever lifting a stone block or marching into a battlefield. In Rome, proximity to power mattered far more than moral clarity, and this job had plenty of the former. Wealthy Romans purchased dwarfs as entertainers, companions, household curiosities, or symbols of excess. The seller arranged acquisitions, transport, negotiations, and prices. You weren't involved in daily care. You weren't present for the performances. You handled transactions, paperwork, and introductions, all while smiling politely and pretending this was completely normal, because in Rome, it was. The key advantage of this job was that it operated entirely indoors and entirely among the elite. You met senators, wealthy merchants, and powerful households who wanted exclusive items and didn't ask many questions. You didn't sweat, you didn't bleed, you didn't freeze. And you certainly weren't sent to fight anyone. The pay reflected the discomfort. Rare goods brought high prices, and commissions were generous. A single successful sale could fund months of comfortable living, and successful sellers built reputations that traveled quietly through aristocratic circles. Rome loved novelty, and novelty always paid well. Was the job morally disturbing by modern standards? Without question, but Rome didn't run on modern standards. It ran on status, spectacle, and social dominance. The dwarf seller survived by understanding that reality and navigating it without becoming the product. There was risk, of course. Say the wrong thing, insult the wrong patron, or mishandle a transaction, and your career ended abruptly, but that was true of nearly every Roman job, except most of them also involved physical pain. Compared to quarry labor, military service, or sewage maintenance, this job required no muscle and very little danger, just negotiation skills, discretion, and the ability to treat deeply strange demands as routine business. In ancient Rome, the best jobs weren't ethical, they were strategic, and the dwarf seller, unsettling as the role was, understood the market perfectly and stayed comfortably alive because of it. At some point in ancient Rome, someone looked at a public urinal and thought, this could be taxed. That person was not joking, and thanks to that moment of inspiration, an entire profession was born. Yes, Rome taxed urine. Urine was valuable, not symbolically, practically. It was rich in ammonia, which made it perfect for tanning leather and cleaning clothes. Romanis relied on it. Tanners depended on it. And the empire, never one to miss a revenue opportunity, decided it deserved a place in the tax system. Enter the urine tax collector. This job did not involve personal participation in the process, which is an important clarification. You weren't standing around with jars, hoping for a productive afternoon. You were an official. You oversaw public collection points, recorded usage, and ensured businesses paid their share for accessing this oddly precious resource. In other words, you worked with ledgers, not buckets. The beauty of this job was its authority. You represented the state. That meant legal backing, protection, and a level of respect most Romans never experienced. When you showed up, people listened, not because they liked you, but because ignoring you had consequences. Was the environment glamorous? Absolutely not. But it was urban, predictable, and indoors adjacent. You weren't breaking rocks in the sun or freezing in a border garrison, wondering if today was the day a spear found you. You had a route, a routine, and a steady income. And here's the most Roman part of all. Nobody laughed at you. They might have complained, grumbled, or insulted the tax itself, but they didn't mock the job because Rome understood something very clearly. Anything that funded the empire was serious business. If urine kept the economy running, then the man taxing it was doing important work. There was also a certain ironic prestige to it. You could casually mention your job at dinner and watch people become uncomfortable. Not impressed, uncomfortable, which in Roman social dynamics was a subtle form of power. Of course, discretion mattered. You didn't dwell on details. You didn't overshare. You kept your explanation short and official. The less said, the better. Compared to most Roman employment, this job was stable, non-violent, and oddly secure. The empire would always need revenue. People would always produce urine. Andres would always complain about taxes. In ancient Rome, this was not a joke job. It was proof that if something existed, Rome would find a way to monetize it. Ancient Rome cared deeply about appearances. Not morality, not equality, but appearances. And one of the most important appearances a respectable Roman could maintain was the illusion of effortlessness, including the complete absence of visible body hair in places society had decided were unacceptable, which brings us to the armpit hair plucker. This was not a joke job. This was grooming. And grooming in Rome was culture. Wealthy Romans believed that excess body hair signaled laziness, barbarism, or worst of all, someone who might actually enjoy physical labor. so they paid specialists to remove it for them slowly and thoroughly, one hair at a time. As an armpit hair plucker, your work took place indoors, usually in private homes or baths. You had regular clients, repeat business, predictable hours, and while the job required patience and a strong tolerance for awkward silence, it did not involve heavy lifting open wounds or military service, which already placed it well above average on the Roman career ladder. The tools were simple: tweezers, resin, and the confidence to inflict controlled discomfort while pretending nothing unusual was happening. You were expected to work carefully, efficiently, and without commentary. Any reaction from you, surprise, judgment, laughter, would be deeply unprofessional. The goal was to make the process feel routine, even when it absolutely was not. Pain was part of the transaction, but that pain belonged to the client, not you. And clients paid well to feel refined afterward. Smooth skin was a status symbol. It said, "I do not toil, I do not sweat for survival." Someone else handles that, and that someone could be you. Socially, this job placed you in a strange but advantageous position. You were close to the elite yet beneath notice. You heard conversations without being part of them. You learned secrets without being trusted with them. You were invisible, and invisibility in Rome was often safety. Was it glamorous? No. Was it dignified? Debatable. Was it safer than farming, quarry work, or rowing a ship? Absolutely. Most Roman jobs destroyed your body. This one required steady hands, emotional detachment, and the ability to pretend this was all perfectly normal, which in Rome it was. If you wanted a job that kept you indoors, fed and alive, and you didn't mind prolonged proximity to someone else's armpit, this was a surprisingly solid career choice. In ancient Rome, civilization hurt, and someone always got paid to manage the pain. Ancient Romans loved a good funeral, not because they enjoyed death, although they were strangely comfortable with it, but because funerals were performances, status displays, public reminders that the deceased mattered, and that their family could afford to prove it. And nothing said important person quite like hiring strangers to cry dramatically on your behalf. Enter the professional mourner. This job required no physical strength, no literacy, no military training, and no long-term emotional commitment. All it required was volume, timing, and the ability to look convincingly devastated about someone you had met roughly 5 minutes ago. Professional mourners were hired to attend funerals, processions, and memorial rites, where they wailed, sobbed, tore at their clothing, and generally made a scene. The louder and more theatrical the grief, the more impressive the funeral appeared. Roman families believed visible sorrow honored the dead, even if that sorrow was purchased by the hour. From a career perspective, this was excellent news. The work was temporary, the pay was decent, and once the funeral ended, so did your responsibilities. You didn't have to stay sad. You didn't have to remember the deceased's name. You simply collected your payment and moved on to the next performance. Emotional labor? Yes, but only on schedule. The job was physically safe. You weren't carrying heavy loads, inhaling toxic fumes, or standing in front of angry animals. You were walking, crying, gesturing, and occasionally collapsing with dramatic flair. Compared to quarry labor or military service, this was a luxury. There was also a strange social benefit. Professional mourners were expected to be expressive, which meant you could openly scream about injustice, fate, and the cruelty of life. Things most Romans felt, but rarely voiced. In a controlled setting, grief became socially acceptable chaos. And no one took your words personally. That was the beauty of it. If you cried about betrayal, loss, or suffering, it was assumed to be symbolic, therapeutic, even. You were voicing emotions on behalf of everyone else. Of course, reputation mattered. A good mourner knew how to pace their grief. To quiet and you looked cheap. To dramatic, and you risked becoming distracting. Balance was key. Timing was everything. Was it dignified? Not really. Was it stable? Reasonably. Was it safer than most Roman jobs? Undeniably. In ancient Rome, grief was a service, and if you could cry on command, Rome was willing to pay you for it. If there was one place in ancient Rome where life felt almost civilized, it was the bathhouse. Warm rooms, flowing water, food vendors nearby, gossip everywhere. It was less public hygiene and more social headquarters with steam. And if you worked there, congratulations. You had one of the most stable and tolerable jobs in the entire empire. Bathhouse attendants were everywhere. They managed too, oils, water temperature, seating, and occasionally the delicate task of telling powerful men that yes, it was in fact time to leave the pool. This required confidence, tact, and the ability to sound apologetic while being absolutely firm, a skill Rome valued deeply. The best part, you worked indoors, always warm, always near food, always near people who had money, in a city where winter, disease, and exhaustion were constant threats. A heated building with regular hours was a gift from the gods. Yes, you saw bodies, a lot of them. After the first week, this stopped registering as strange. Roman modesty was flexible at best, and baths were judgment-free zones long before that phrase existed. Your job was not to react. Your job was to assist, not politely, and pretend everything happening was completely normal, which in Rome it was. The social advantage of this job cannot be overstated. Bathhouses were where deals were made, rumors spread, and political opinions slipped out between steam clouds. As an attendant, you heard everything while being noticed by no one. You weren't important enough to threaten anyone, and that made you invisible, which in ancient Rome was a form of protection. Payment was steady, tips were common, and regular patrons often favored attendants they trusted, ensuring repeat income and informal protection. No one wanted to anger the person who handled the oils or knew where their belongings were stored. Was it glamorous? No. Was it occasionally unpleasant? Yes. Was it infinitely better than farming, quarry work, or marching toward a battlefield? Without question, most Roman jobs destroyed the body. This one required awareness, patience, and social intelligence. And unlike many professions, it didn't end with you being buried far from home, with no one remembering your name. In ancient Rome, warmth was power, and bathhouse attendants lived right at the center of it. Gambling in ancient Rome was officially frowned upon, technically restricted, and enthusiastically practiced by almost everyone with spare coins and poor impulse control. Dice games popped up in taverns, back rooms, private homes, and anywhere two Romans could argue loudly enough, and where money and tempers met. Someone sensible needed to stand in the middle. That someone was the dice game referee. This job existed because Romans were passionate gamblers and even more passionate sore losers. Accusations of cheating were common. Voices rose quickly, and knives had an alarming tendency to appear during disagreements over whose throw clearly counted. A neutral referee prevented games from turning into crime scenes. As a referee, your job was not to gamble. That was crucial. You observed the throws, enforced rules, verified payouts, and shut things down when tensions escalated. You were the adult in the room, which in Rome automatically made you valuable. The best part was the clientele. Dice games attracted people with money, merchants, retired soldiers, minor officials, wealthy freedmen, all eager to test luck after a few drinks. They paid referees well because losing money was painful, but losing money unfairly was unacceptable. Your presence reassured everyone that outcomes were legitimate, even when they absolutely were not. This job required confidence, a calm voice, and the ability to stare down a man who believed fate personally hated him. You didn't argue, you stated rulings clearly and moved on. Lingering meant trouble. Authority had to be quick and final. Physically, the work was easy. You stood, watched, occasionally intervened, and collected payment. No heavy labor. No marching, rowing, or freezing. The biggest risk came from choosing the wrong venue or failing to exit at the right moment. Skills any experienced referee learned quickly. Socially, it was an excellent position. You were trusted but not involved. Everyone wanted you there, but no one blamed you for losing their money, unless they were drunk, in which case you left immediately. Discretion kept you alive. Was it glamorous? No. Was it safe? Relatively? Was it smarter than most Roman employment options? Absolutely. In a society where fortune was ripped and blamed in equal measure, the person who enforced the rules of chance held quiet power. You didn't beat the odds. You made sure they were followed, and in ancient Rome, that was a very respectable way to stay alive. Ancient Rome was built on concrete, conquest, and an absolutely uncheckable belief that invisible forces were deeply invested in everyone's personal business. Gods, spirits, omens, dreams. Rome trusted them all, especially when life felt unpredictable, which was always, and that made fortune sellers incredibly useful. A fortune seller was not a prophet. Let's clear that up immediately. This job had nothing to do with divine insight and everything to do with carefully worded reassurance. You didn't predict the future. You suggested possibilities, favorable ones, vague ones that could not be proven wrong without a time machine. Your tools were simple, symbolic objects, dramatic pauses, and sentences that sounded meaningful while committing to nothing. A change approaches, beware envy. Fortune favors patience. These statements worked on everyone from anxious merchants to senators who absolutely should have known better. The brilliance of this job was safety. You weren't responsible for outcomes. If something good happened, you were clearly gifted. If something bad happened, the client had misunderstood, ignored advice, or angered the gods in unrelated ways. Either way, you were not at fault. Rome respected that logic. You worked indoors or in busy public spaces. You didn't lift anything heavy. You didn't fight anyone. You didn't travel far unless you wanted to. Clients came to you desperate for certainty in a world where disease, debt, and politics could end a life overnight. Payment varied, but repeat customers were common. People loved hearing what they already believed, especially when it sounded official. And because Romans were deeply superstitious, no one mocked the profession openly. Even skeptics avoided criticism, unless in case the fortune seller was right. Socially, this job placed you in a fascinating position. People told you their fears, their hopes, their secrets. You nodded thoughtfully and never reacted. Reacting would have been unprofessional. Your power came from listening, not speaking too much. The only real danger was being too specific. Predict a date, a name, or an event, and you invited trouble. Skilled fortune sellers avoided details like the plague, which coincidentally was also something people asked about. Was it honest? No. Was it lucrative? Yes. Was it safer than farming, soldiering, or stone cutting? Without question, in ancient Rome, certainty was rare. Confidence was priceless, and if you could sell calm reassurance wrapped in mystery, Rome would gladly pay you for it. Ancient Rome loved words. Laws were carved into stone. Poems were scratched onto walls. Insults were immortalized in public places where no one could pretend they hadn't seen them. And long before comment sections and burner accounts, Rome had graffiti. A lot of graffiti. Not everyone could write, though. Literacy was useful, respected, and surprisingly rare. So, if you could write clearly, quickly, and without panicking, people were willing to pay you to put words where they didn't want to be seen doing it themselves. Enter the graffiti writer for hire. This job involved painting or scratching messages onto walls, columns, and buildings across the city. Political slogans, love notes, insults, threats, advertisements, and public shaming all needed a discreet hand. You weren't expressing yourself, you were ghostwriting outrage. The genius of this job was anonymity. Your client stayed invisible, and so did you. Ideally, a good graffiti writer worked at odd hours, chose locations carefully, and left no trace beyond the message itself. Speed mattered. Legibility mattered, and spelling mattered a lot. Nothing undermined a political insult faster than a grammar mistake. Physically, the work was manageable. You walked, climbed a little, wrote, and left. No heavy lifting, no full-day labor, no one shouting orders at you unless you were caught, which was strongly discouraged. Most jobs were completed quickly, paid in advance, and forgotten by morning. Socially, this role was fascinating. You shaped public opinion without attaching your name to it. People argued over your words in the forum while you watched quietly from the side, fully aware that none of them knew you were responsible. Power without visibility, a rare Roman luxury. The risks were real, but limited. Graffiti was technically illegal in many contexts, especially political messages. Getting caught could mean fines, punishment, or worse, depending on who felt targeted. Skilled writers minimized risk by avoiding extremes. No direct accusations against powerful individuals, no signatures, no lingering. Clients ranged from lovers and merchants to politicians and rivals settling grudges through plaster and paint. Everyone wanted their message seen, but not traced. You provided that service. Was it respectable? Not officially. Was it profitable? Often. Was it safer than being a soldier or a laborer? Absolutely. In ancient Rome, words were weapons. And if you knew how to wield them quietly, you could make a living shaping the city's voice, one wall at a time. On paper, being a food taster in ancient Rome sounds like a terrible idea. You eat first. If the food is poisoned, you find out immediately. End of Job. End of life. And yet somehow this was considered a good position. Not because Romans were reckless, but because they were paranoid in a very specific, very organized way. Food tasters were employed by wealthy households, officials, and powerful patrons who were deeply concerned that someone somewhere was plotting to end them via dinner, which meant the person eating first needed to be trusted, protected, and kept very close. Here's the key detail people miss. Poisonings were rare. Romans talked about them constantly, feared them obsessively, and accused each other of them regularly. But actual successful poisonings were uncommon. Most deaths came from disease, accidents, or politics conducted with weapons, not cutlery. That meant the food taster's job was less daily gamble with death and more symbolic reassurance. You took a few bites, waited briefly, showed no immediate symptoms, and the household relaxed. Dinner proceeded. Everyone congratulated themselves on surviving another evening. In return, you ate well, exceptionally well. You sampled the best food in the house every single day. Fresh bread, meat, wine, fruit. None of the barley GRL or questionable leftovers most Romans lived on. If you survived long enough to build trust, your position became permanent, and permanent meant protection. Food tasters were rarely alone. They lived near their employer, traveled with them, and were guarded indirectly by the same people guarding the patron. Killing the taster was not useful unless you intended to kill the main target immediately afterward, which meant random poisoning attempts were unlikely. Socially, the role carried strange prestige. You were not important, but you were necessary. People noticed if you weren't there. You had access to rooms others didn't. You heard conversations while pretending not to hear them. Silence, once again, was your most valuable skill. The real risk came from carelessness, not poison, overindulgence, alcohol, poor health. But those risks applied to everyone. Was it dangerous technically? Was it wealthed, sheltered, and stable? Very much so. Was it better than quarry work, soldiering, or sanitation? Without question. In ancient Rome, the person who ate first didn't just protect the powerful. They protected themselves with good food, steady shelter, and the quiet comfort of being needed. When people hear animals and ancient Rome in the same sentence, their minds immediately leap to the arena. Blood, chaos, and someone being dramatically mauled for entertainment. Fortunately, that is not the job we're talking about. This is the other animal profession, the safer one, the version that doesn't end with applause. Wealthy Romans loved exotic animals, lions, leopards, monkeys, strange birds, and creatures most citizens had never seen outside of rumors. Owning one was a status symbol, a way of saying, "I am so rich I import problems from other continents." And once those animals arrived, someone had to take care of them. That someone was the exotic animal handler. Your job was feeding, cleaning, training, transporting, and showing off animals that were meant to be admired, not weaponized. These creatures lived in private menageries, villas, gardens, and estates, far from screaming crowds and sharp objects. You worked under controlled conditions, usually with animals accustomed to human presence. This was animal care, not combat choreography. The work required knowledge and calm, not strength. You needed to understand behavior, routine, and how not to startle something with teeth. Handlers who survived their first year learned quickly. Handlers who didn't, well, Rome had a large population. The benefits were significant. You worked for elite households, which meant protection, decent food, and stable shelter. You weren't out in the fields. You weren't marching with a shield. You weren't breathing quarry dust. You had a specialized skill that made you harder to replace. And replaceability was the real killer in Roman employment. There was also prestige. People listened to you when animals were involved. If a wealthy patron wanted to show off their imported leopard, your presence mattered. You were the expert. You were the reason the display didn't turn into a very expensive disaster. Yes, there was risk. These were animals, not pets. But compared to the arena, the odds were far better. No crowds demanding blood, no scheduled violence, just routine respect and careful distance. Was it safe? Safer than it sounds. Was it respectable? Surprisingly so. Was it better than most Roman jobs? Easily. In ancient Rome, survival often came down to one rule. Don't work where people expect things to die for entertainment. Exotic animal handler, the quiet version, passed that test beautifully. Every great civilization is judged by its monuments, its laws, and eventually its toilets. Ancient Rome, to its credit, took sanitation seriously. Public latrines were common, busy, and absolutely essential. And because anything essential in Rome became regulated, taxed, and supervised, someone had to manage them. That someone was the public toilet manager. This job sounds unpleasant until you compare it to literally anything involving a shovel, a battlefield, or the open sea. As a toilet manager, you oversaw access, cleanliness, maintenance, and order. You weren't cleaning with your bare hands all day. That work was delegated. You supervised. You collected fees when applicable. You made sure the system kept functioning and function mattered. Roman public toilets were social spaces. People talked, argued, conducted business, shared gossip. They were not quiet, shameful corners. They were communal, practical, and surprisingly orderly. Someone had to ensure that order remained intact, and that was you. The greatest advantage of this job was stability. People never stopped using toilets ever. Wars, plagues, political chaos. None of it interrupted the basic human need to sit down and contemplate life choices. That meant steady employment, steady income, and municipal protection. You worked for the city. The city in return wanted you alive. Socially, this role came with an odd authority. You controlled access to something everyone needed. That meant people listened when you spoke. You weren't glamorous, but you weren't invisible either. You had a place in the urban system that could not be ignored. The smell? Yes, let's acknowledge it. It existed. But Rome already smelled like smoke, animals, sweat, and ambition. The toilets didn't stand out as much as you'd think. And after a short adjustment period, your nose simply surrendered. Physically, the job was manageable. Indoors, no heavy lifting, no exposure to weather, no marching orders. The most dangerous part of your day was telling an angry citizen that no, this was not the correct place to argue about politics. Was it pleasant? Not exactly. Was it reliable? Absolutely. Was it safer than farming, quarry work, or military service? by a wide margin. In ancient Rome, power often came from controlling necessities, and nothing was more necessary or more inevitable than the public toilet. In ancient Rome, being able to read and write was not common. It wasn't expected. It wasn't universal. And that single fact quietly turned literacy into one of the most powerful survival tools in the entire empire. If you could write and write well, Rome had work for you. Enter the letter writer. This job existed because a shocking number of Romans had things they desperately needed to say, but absolutely could not spell. Love letters, legal complaints, business deals, apologies, threats, petitions to officials. All of it required words, and words required you. As a letter writer, your work was clean, indoor, and mentally demanding rather than physically destructive. You sat, you listened, you translated emotional chaos into respectable Latin. You turned rambling speeches into persuasive arguments and romantic disasters into something vaguely poetic. Clients came from every level of society. Merchants needed contracts, soldiers needed letters home, politicians needed messages that said just enough and absolutely no more. You were trusted with private thoughts, personal grievances, and occasionally plans that were best not repeated aloud. The real advantage of this job was discretion. You were expected to forget what you wrote the moment the ink dried. Asking questions was unprofessional. Offering opinions was dangerous. Silence kept you employed. Payment was steady. Repeat clients were common. Once people trusted you, they returned. And trust in Rome was far more valuable than raw talent. A good letter writer became indispensable, especially to powerful people who could not afford to sound foolish. Socially, this role placed you in a unique position. You weren't important enough to threaten anyone, but you were important enough to be protected. People needed you alive, sober, and quiet. That combination extended your life expectancy dramatically. There were risks, of course. Writing something that offended the wrong person could end badly, but careful wording, neutral tone, and professional detachment minimized danger. A skilled letter writer knew how to say much while promising little. A talent Rome admired deeply. Was it glamorous? No. Was it influential? Quietly? Was it safer than most Roman jobs? Absolutely. In a world ruled by force, the ability to control language was rare power. And if you could shape words for others without attaching your name to them, Rome rewarded you, not with fame, but with survival. Ancient Rome was deeply religious, but not in the comforting, personal way people sometimes imagine. Roman religion was transactional. You offered the gods respect, sacrifices, and proper rituals, and in return, you hoped they didn't ruin your life. Getting that exchange right mattered a lot, and not everyone knew how. That gap created the religious access facilitator. This was not a priest. Priests had duties, rules, and public responsibilities. You, on the other hand, had connections. You knew which temples were influential, which priests were flexible, and which rituals carried the most social weight. You understood timing, protocol, and most importantly, who needed an introduction and who absolutely did not. Your job was arranging access. You scheduled meetings with religious officials, secured favorable ritual slots, advised on offerings, and quietly smoothed over mistakes. Say the wrong prayer, offend the wrong god, miss an auspicious day. That's where you stepped in, calmly explaining that for a modest fee everything could be corrected. The brilliance of this role was proximity to power without responsibility. Politicians, generals, merchants, and ambitious families all wanted divine favor, or at least the appearance of it. You helped them achieve that without ever claiming divine authority yourself. If things went well, the gods were pleased. If things went badly, fate was unpredictable. Either way, it was never your fault. Work conditions were excellent. Indoors, civilized hours, no physical labor, no travel unless paid well. You dressed respectably, spoke carefully, and cultivated an air of quiet importance. People listened to you because they believed you understood the invisible systems that governed their lives. Payment came in favors, gifts, and ongoing patronage. A successful facilitator didn't need many clients, just influential ones. Once embedded in elite circles, you became difficult to remove. Everyone needed you. No one wanted to offend you. The danger lay in overpromising, claim too much authority and priests would notice. Fail to deliver and clients would vanish. Skilled facilitators stayed vague, reassuring, and impeccably polite. Confidence without specificity was the key. Was it religious? Not really. Was it political? Entirely. Was it safer than most Roman professions? Without question, in ancient Rome, belief was power, and the person who controlled access to belief never had to raise their voice or lift a sword. After touring Rome's strangest yet surprisingly survivable professions, one truth becomes painfully clear. The best job in ancient Rome wasn't about prestige, honor, or heroism. It was about location, specifically whether your job kept you indoors and away from heavy objects, sharp weapons, angry crowds, and the weather. Ancient Rome was not designed for comfort. It was loud, crowded, unsanitary, and violently unpredictable. Most people worked outdoors, under the sun, in the cold, or under someone else's boot. Farming destroyed your body, construction crushed it. Soldiering shortened your life, and sanitation work tested your will to live on a spiritual level. So, the real career advice in Rome was simple. If you could sit down while working, you were already winning. Indoor jobs meant shade in summer, warmth in winter, and at least a fighting chance of seeing old age. They also meant proximity to power, and proximity to power was the single most reliable survival strategy in the empire. The closer you worked to wealthy households, officials, or institutions, the more protected you became. Not respected necessarily, but protected, and protection mattered more than dignity. Every job we've covered shared a common theme: discretion. You didn't speak unless asked, you didn't stand out, you didn't moralize. You provided a service people wanted and quietly removed yourself from their attention. Rome rewarded usefulness, not bravery. The people who lived longest weren't the strongest or the loudest. They were the ones who avoided extremes. They stayed neutral, they stayed needed, they stayed alive. It's tempting to imagine ancient Rome as a place of glory. Marble columns, triumphs, heroic deaths. But for most people, survival was the real victory. And survival came from choosing work that didn't involve risk, spectacle, or ideology. If you could read, organize, observe, manage, or simply stay calm while everyone else lost their mind, Rome had a place for you. Maybe not an admirable place, but a safe one. And in a society where public entertainment often involved death, safety was the highest luxury available. So yes, the best job in ancient Rome was any job that kept you indoors, unremarkable and quietly indispensable. Because in Rome, the greatest achievement wasn't fame, it was waking up tomorrow. The moment a medieval king died, his queen ceased to be a living partner in power and became something else entirely. Not merely a widow, but a symbol. Her grief was no longer her own. It belonged to the court, the church, and the kingdom, watching closely for signs of weakness, impropriety, or ambition. Death did not release her from duty. It reshaped it. In many courts, the queen learned of the king's death surrounded by witnesses, ladies-in-waiting, bishops, senior nobles. Private sobbing was discouraged. Public composure was required. The first act of mourning began immediately. The removal of color, jewels were taken away, bright fabrics vanished. The queen was dressed in dark wool or heavy black silk. Fabrics chosen not for comfort, but for visibility. Everyone needed to see that grief had begun. Her chambers often became sealed spaces, windows shuttered, mirrors covered. In some kingdoms, queens were expected to remain indoors for weeks or months, cut off from daily court life. Meals were taken in silence. Music stopped. Laughter, even accidental, could become scandal. Mourning was meant to be total, immersive, and unmistakable. Yet, This isolation was carefully staged. The queen was hidden, but not forgotten. Messengers reported on her behavior. Courtiers whispered about how often she prayed, how thin she looked, how rarely she appeared. Excessive sorrow could be praised as devotion, too little could be read as relief. Public rituals followed strict choreography. When the queen finally emerged for airy processions, she moved slowly, eyes lowered, veiled in black so heavy it obscured her face. She was expected to cry, but not uncontrollably, to kneel, but not collapse. Even terrors had rules. Widowhood also came with immediate political danger. A grieving queen could still be powerful, especially if her son was young. This made her mourning suspicious. Every gesture was interpreted. Was her sorrow genuine, or was she already calculating alliances, marriages, regencies? In theory, mourning honored love and loyalty. In practice, it was surveillance. A queen in mourning was watched more closely than a queen at court. Her grief had to reassure the realm that nothing had changed, even though everything had. In medieval courts, mourning was spoken through fabric before it was spoken through words. Clothing became a public declaration of grief, and for queens, it followed an unbending code. Black was not simply a color, it was a signal of withdrawal, humility, and ritual obedience. To wear it incorrectly or too briefly was to invite suspicion. The queen's mourning wardrobe was assembled with care. Heavy black wool for daily wear, thick silk for ceremonial appearances. No embroidery, no shine, no metallic thread. Even buttons and fastenings were muted or hidden. The goal was not elegance, but erasure. The queen was expected to fade visually from court life, to become a shadow of her former presence. Veils were essential. A widow queen's veil often covered her hair, her neck, and sometimes most of her face. Hair, associated with vitality and fertility, had to be concealed. In some courts, queens were required to cut their hair or keep it bound tightly beneath layers of cloth. This was not symbolic modesty alone, it was a deliberate stripping of attractiveness. A mourning queen was not meant to inspire desire. Jewelry disappeared entirely, crowns were set aside, rings were removed, sometimes ceremonially broken or locked away. Even signet rings could be restricted, limiting the queen's ability to issue orders or seal documents. Mourning had teeth. It killed power as much as it displayed sorrow. The length of this visual mourning mattered. Queens were expected to wear black for months, often years. In some kingdoms, lifelong black was encouraged, especially if remarriage was politically inconvenient. A queen who returned to color too quickly risked accusations of disrespect toward the dead king or worse, eagerness to move on. But there was also danger in overperformance. Excessively ragged clothing or extreme self-denial could be read as instability. The queen had to look sorrowful but still controlled, devastated but dignified. The balance was narrow and failure was remembered. These garments were heavy, uncomfortable, and impractical. Thick layers trapped heat in summer and cold in winter. Yet discomfort was part of the ritual. Mourning was supposed to weigh on the body. Grief had to be visible not only in appearance, but in posture and movement. In this way, clothing became a constant reminder. Every step, every breath reinforced loss. The queen did not simply mourn. She wore mourning, lived inside it, and allowed it to define her place in the world. And still, the cloth hid more than it revealed. After the funeral rites ended, the queen's mourning entered its most severe phase, isolation. In many medieval courts, a widow queen was expected to withdraw physically from the world, retreating into a carefully controlled domestic exile. This was not grief as comfort, it was grief as containment. Entire sections of palaces were closed off, doors were locked, curtains drawn, servants reduced to a minimum. In some cases, queens were confined to a single suite of rooms, leaving only for prayer or strictly supervised appearances. The stated reason was contemplation and devotion. The unspoken reason was control. Isolation served several purposes. First, it prevented scandal. A grieving queen seen too often in public risked gossip. A queen seen with the wrong people risked worse. By removing her from circulation, the court reduced opportunities for rumor, flirtation, or political maneuvering during a vulnerable transition of power. Second, isolation demonstrated obedience. Withdrawal showed submission to custom and church expectation. A queen who embraced solitude appeared humble, pious, and appropriately broken by loss. Resistance, even subtle, could be interpreted as pride or ambition. Daily life inside these locked rooms followed ritual monotony. Hours were marked by prayer, meals were plain, conversation was minimal. Silence was not merely encouraged, it was cultivated. Music, if permitted at all, was religious and subdued. Laughter was forbidden, joy was suspect. Yet isolation did not mean invisibility. The queen was constantly observed. Confessors reported on her spiritual state. Ladies in waiting noted her behavior. Physicians commented on her appetite, sleep, and tears. The court wanted reassurance that grief was progressing at the correct pace. This confinement could last weeks or months, sometimes longer. For queens who ruled as regents or held political authority, isolation was often partial and strategically adjusted. They might conduct affairs of state from behind curtains or screens, unseen but present. Grief, in this case, became a performance layered over continued power. For others, isolation marked the beginning of permanent withdrawal. Some queens never fully returned to court life. They aged in shadow, their public identities frozen at the moment of their husband's death. Locked rooms were meant to quiet the soul. In reality, they amplified fear, grief, and uncertainty. Alone with memory and expectation, the queen mourned not only her husband, but the life she was no longer allowed to live. And the kingdom waited outside the door. When a mourning queen was finally seen again, her appearance was never spontaneous. Public grief was staged with the same care as a coronation. Every movement, every pause, every tear belonged to a ritual older than the woman performing it. Funeral processions were the first and most critical display. The queen walked slowly, often supported on either side, as if weakened by sorrow. Her head remained bowed. Her eyes were cast downward, rarely meeting the crowd. A heavy veil concealed her face, but not completely. People needed to see enough to believe. Tears were expected. Silence was expected. Collapse was not. A queen who sobbed uncontrollably risked appearing unstable. One who showed no emotion risked appearing cold or relieved. The correct grief was measured, dignified, and repeatable. Courtiers remembered these performances for years. Public mourning extended beyond funerals, anniversaries of death, religious feast days, and memorial masses required renewed displays of sorrow. Each appearance reaffirmed loyalty to the deceased king and continuity for the realm. Grief became cyclical, summoned on command. Even gestures carried meaning. Kneeling too long could be read as theatrical. Rising too quickly could be read as impatience. A queen's hands were expected to remain still, folded or clasped. Nervous movement was scrutinized. Every deviation invited interpretation. Crowds mattered. Mourning before common people served a different purpose than mourning before nobles. For the public, the queen embodied shared loss. Her sorrow reassured them that the king's death was not merely political but human. For the nobility, her grief signaled stability and submission to tradition. This performance extended to speech. When queens spoke during mourning, their words were limited and formal. References to divine will were common. Expressions of personal pain were restrained. Love was implied, not described. Too much emotion could seem manipulative. The irony was cruel. These moments often marked the queen's only contact with the outside world after months of isolation. Yet even then, she was not free. She was a figure in a ritual, repeating gestures learned from those who came before her. Public grief was never about healing. It was about reassurance. It told the kingdom that order remained intact, that loss had been absorbed, and that power had not fractured. The queen wept so the realm could move on. Grief did not suspend politics. It sharpened it. A mourning queen stood at the most dangerous intersection of sympathy and suspicion, and every faction at court understood this. Her sorrow could protect her. It could also be used against her. Widowhood created uncertainty. If the queen had a son, especially a young one, she might become regent. This made her mourning deeply political. Excessive displays of grief reassured rivals that she was not plotting. Calm efficiency suggested competence, but risked appearing cold. Either interpretation could be weaponized. Courtiers watched for signs. Who visited her chambers, who carried her messages, who spoke for her when she remained silent. Mourning restricted movement, but not influence. Letters passed quietly. Confessors doubled as informants. Ladies-in-waiting served as eyes and ears. Some queens used mourning deliberately. Extended withdrawal could frustrate rivals by denying access. Silence could create mystique. A queen unseen, but spoken of retained power precisely because she was absent. Her grief became a shield behind which decisions were made. Others were trapped by it. Advisors might insist she remain secluded longer than custom required, effectively sidelining her. Appeals to propriety masked political containment. A queen who resisted could be accused of disrespecting her dead husband. Remarriage complicated everything. In theory, a queen might remarry for alliance or protection. In practice, too much eagerness damaged her reputation. A second marriage suggested that the first had not been deeply mourned. Waiting too long risked losing political relevance. Timing was critical and rarely under her control. The church played a quiet role. Confessors advised patience, humility, and acceptance. These virtues aligned neatly with political stability. Religious language softened hard power decisions. Mourning became a moral framework used to justify exclusion or delay. Even foreign courts paid attention. Ambassadors reported on how long the queen wore black, how often she appeared in public, whether she spoke of the king with reverence. Grief became intelligence. In this atmosphere, sorrow was never neutral. It could legitimize authority or undermine it. A grieving queen was pied, respected, feared, and constrained all at once. Power did not disappear in mourning. It learned to speak softly through ritual, absence, and carefully controlled sorrow. For many medieval queens, mourning was not a season, it was a destination. While kings remarried quickly and widowers were encouraged to restore dynastic stability, queens were often expected to remain in widowhood indefinitely. In theory, this devotion honored the dead. In practice, it simplified politics. A permanently widowed queen posed fewer complications. She produced no rival heirs. She formed no new alliances through marriage. Her loyalty remained fixed to a dynasty that no longer needed her ambition. Lifelong mourning transformed a queen from a political variable into a controlled relic of the past. This expectation was reinforced through custom rather than law. Advisors spoke of dignity. Clerics praised chastity and restraint. Courtiers whispered about impropriety at the suggestion of remarriage. The pressure was subtle but relentless. A queen who chose to remain in black was praised as virtuous. One who wished to re-enter life risked scandal. Permanent mourning reshaped daily existence. Black clothing became habitual. Public appearances grew rare. The queen's household shrank. Younger attendants were replaced by older, quieter women. Liveliness gave way to routine. Over time, the queen's identity fused entirely with loss. Some queens retreated into religious life. They founded convents, sponsored monasteries, or adopted near monastic routines within palaces. Prayer replaced politics. Charity replaced ceremony. This withdrawal was often celebrated as holiness, though it conveniently removed influential women from court. Others remained visible but diminished. They attended coronations, weddings, and councils as symbolic figures rather than active participants. Their presence lent continuity, a living memory of the previous reign. They reminded everyone where power had been, not where it was going. The psychological toll was immense. Youth ended abruptly. Desire was erased by expectation. Loneliness was sanctified. A queen could live decades after her husband's death. defined entirely by an event she could never escape. Yet permanence brought a strange authority. A long-widowed queen was untouchable, her suffering granted moral weight. Criticizing her risked appearing cruel. In silence and shadow, she accumulated a different kind of power. Mourning meant to fade became a second crown, heavy, invisible, and impossible to remove. When a medieval queen died, the rituals that had governed her life in mourning now turned toward her body. Death did not erase ceremony, it intensified it. Her funeral became a final performance shaped by the same expectations that had defined her grief. Preparation began immediately. The queen's body was washed, anointed, and dressed with deliberate symbolism. If she had lived in mourning, black garments were often replaced with rich ceremonial robes for burial, signaling transition rather than sorrow. Crowns once set aside might return in death, restoring the dignity suspended in widowhood. The body lay in state, sometimes for days. Candles burned continuously, clergy chanted prayers for the soul. Nobles filed past in silence. This display reaffirmed hierarchy even in death. Who stood closest, who knelt longest, who touched the bier, all carried meaning. Funeral processions echoed royal funerals, but with emphasis on piety rather than power. Effigies were sometimes used, especially when the body could not be publicly displayed. These lifelike figures wore regalia, allowing the queen to appear one final time before her people. Mourning extended outward, the court wore black again. Bells tolled across cities, masses were ordered. Public grief was expected even from those who had never seen the queen alive. Her death became communal property. Burial sites were chosen carefully. Queens were often interred near their husbands, reinforcing dynastic unity beyond death. Tombs depicted idealized images, serene faces, hands folded in prayer, eternal calm. The years of constraint and isolation disappeared beneath carved stone. Inscriptions emphasized virtue, loyalty, fertility, and devotion. Political conflict was erased. Personal suffering was smoothed into piety. The queen's life was rewritten in marble. Ironically, death offered a freedom denied in life. The dead queen could wear jewels again. She could be publicly honored without suspicion. She could be remembered selectively. The rituals surrounding her funeral closed a long circle. The queen, who had performed grief so carefully, was now the subject of it. Others were black. Others wept in measured silence. Her sorrow ended. The ritual remained. After burial, a queen's mourning did not truly end. It changed form. Her grief, once embodied, became remembered, retold, and reshaped by those who survived her. Memory was selective, and it rarely favored complexity. Chroniclers framed queens according to how well they had performed sorrow. A woman who mourned quietly and long was praised as faithful and virtuous. One who returned to politics or remarried was described as ambitious, cold, or unnatural. Grief became a moral measuring stick applied after death. Art played a powerful role. Illuminated manuscripts depicted widowed queens kneeling in prayer, veiled and subdued. Tapestries showed them beside their husbands, frozen in ideal harmony. Even queens known for sharp political maneuvering were softened in visual memory. Mourning erased edges. Religious foundations ensured remembrance. Queens who endowed monasteries or chapels in memory of their husbands tied their grief to sacred space. Monks prayed for both souls together, reinforcing eternal unity. The queen's sorrow was transformed into perpetual devotion. Anniversaries mattered. Death dates were marked by masses, offerings, and arms. Each ritual renewed the story. Over time, personal grief dissolved into institutional habit. What had once been intimate became routine. Legends grew. Some queens were remembered for tears that never ceased, others for noble restraint. Rarely were they remembered for anger, resentment, or relief. Those emotions did not fit the script. This posthumous shaping served political ends. Dynasties preferred obedient widows in memory. The past was curated to teach future queens how to behave. Mourning became instruction. Yet beneath myth, traces of reality survived. Letters hinted at loneliness, Accounts noted confinement. Marginal notes recorded resistance. These fragments remind us that behind the ritual stood a woman navigating loss under watchful eyes. The queen's grief did not die with her. It became an example, a warning, and a lesson preserved long after the black cloth had faded. By the end of a medieval queen's mourning journey, grief was no longer a response to death. It had become a role so deeply ingrained that separating the woman from the ritual was nearly impossible. What began as loss hardened into expectation. Sorrow was not something she experienced, it was something she embodied. From the moment of widowhood onward, the queen's identity was rewritten. She was no longer defined by marriage, fertility, or shared rule, but by restraint. Her value lay in how convincingly she demonstrated loyalty to a past that could not be revived. Mourning became proof of legitimacy, not emotion. This expectation followed queens across decades. Even when political circumstances changed, when sons came of age or dynasties stabilized, the shadow of grief remained. A queen who had once mourned publicly was expected to carry that posture forever. Joy became inappropriate. Desire became suspicious. Independence became threatening. The tragedy was not that grief was demanded, but that it was never allowed to evolve. Modern mourning assumes a movement through sorrow. Medieval queens were denied that progression. Healing risked misinterpretation. Moving forward suggested disloyalty. Remaining still was safer. In this way, mourning shaped personality. Some queens internalized silence, becoming cautious and reserved even in private. Others learned to wear grief-like armor, using humility to deflect scrutiny while exercising influence quietly. A few resisted, pushing against expectation and paying the price in reputation. What we see in records is often the performance, not the person. Chroniclers praised obedience and piety, mistaking survival for virtue. The inner lives of these women remain mostly hidden, buried beneath ceremony and moral judgment. Yet across kingdoms and centuries, the pattern repeats with striking consistency. Black cloth, locked rooms, measured tears, long years of waiting. This was not coincidence, it was structure. Mourning was one of the few spaces where queens were allowed to exist visibly without threatening male authority. But that visibility came at a cost. It demanded a ratio of joy, agency, and personal renewal. In the end, medieval queens did not simply mourn death, they lived inside it. Their sorrow was curated, enforced, and remembered more clearly than their ambitions or intellect. Power could be taken away, titles could be removed. But grief, once assigned, was permanent, and that was the final ritual. In ancient societies, the world was never neutral. Every space, object, and action existed on a moral map that separated the sacred from the profane. This division was not abstract philosophy. It was a daily reality that shaped how people ate, married, fought, touched one another, and even walked through their own cities. The sacred was not simply holy, it was powerful, volatile, and dangerous. Temples, altars, graves, and ritual objects were believed to hold concentrated force. Approaching them incorrectly risked illness, madness, or divine punishment. The profane, by contrast, was ordinary life, work, sex, trade, and sleep. Mixing the two without preparation was forbidden. Rituals existed to manage this boundary. Before entering sacred space, individuals washed their bodies, fasted, or abstained from sex. Purification was not about cleanliness in a modern sense, it was about realignment. The body had to be tuned to the sacred world before crossing into it. Taboo enforced the line. Certain foods were forbidden at certain times. Certain people were excluded from rituals entirely. Menstruating women, the recently bereaved, the sick, or the foreign could be temporarily dangerous. Not because they were immoral, but because they disrupted spiritual balance. Taboos protected both the individual and the community. Violating these boundaries carried serious consequences. In many cultures, ritual pollution was contagious. One person's mistake could endanger an entire household or city. This belief justified harsh responses, including exile, public confession, or ritual death. Sacred time mattered as much as sacred space. Festivals, fast days, and seasonal rites marked moments when the boundary thinned. During these periods, rules could reverse, sexual freedom might be permitted, violence might be sanctified. The sacred did not always mean restraint. Sometimes it demanded excess. What these divisions reveal is not superstition, but structure. Ancient people understood the world as unstable, filled with forces that required management. Ritual was technology, taboo was law. Together they created order in a universe that felt unpredictable and alive. The line between sacred and profane was not fixed. It shifted with season, status, and circumstance. Navigating it correctly meant survival, crossing it blindly meant chaos. Everything that followed, sacrifice, purity laws, fertility rites, existed to protect that fragile boundary. In ancient cultures, sacrifice was not cruelty for its own sake, it was communication. Blood, breath, and life were currencies powerful enough to cross the boundary between humans and the divine. To sacrifice was to speak in the only language the gods were believed to hear. Human sacrifice, animal sacrifice, and symbolic offerings all followed the same logic. Something valuable had to be surrendered to restore balance. The more severe the crisis, drought, plague, war, or famine, the greater the offering demanded. Sacrifice was not random violence, it was controlled loss performed with precision. Victims were rarely chosen casually. In many societies, they were selected for purity, beauty, or symbolic importance. Children, captives, or individuals without social ties were often preferred, not because they were expendable, but because their deaths carried meaning. Their lives stood in for the community as a whole. The ritual itself was highly structured. Chants, gestures, costumes, and timing mattered. Mistakes could invalidate the offering or provoke divine anger. The moment of death was sacred. Blood spilled onto altars, into earth, or across fire, feeding gods, ancestors, or spirits believed to sustain the world. Breath mattered, too. Final words, cries, or silences were interpreted as signs of acceptance or rejection. In some cultures, the manner of death was more important than the death itself. A calm victim meant approval. Resistance could be ominous. Animal sacrifice followed similar rules scaled to circumstance. The inspection of organs, especially livers and hearts, served as divination. Gods answered through flesh. Meaning was read in color, texture, and form. Modern discomfort with sacrifice often misses its purpose. For ancient societies, sacrifice imposed limits on chaos. It made disaster understandable and response possible. Rather than random suffering, loss became intentional, directed, and therefore meaningful. Importantly, sacrifice reinforced hierarchy. Only priests, kings, or designated specialists could perform it correctly. Access to the sacred was restricted. Power flowed through ritual expertise. Sacrifice drew the sharpest line between sacred and profane. Killing outside ritual was murder. Killing within ritual was necessity. This distinction allowed societies to contain violence while believing they were preserving cosmic order. In giving life, they believed they were protecting it. If sacrifice managed the relationship between humans and gods, purity laws managed the relationship between humans and the unseen forces surrounding them. Ancient cultures believed that danger did not always come from enemies or disasters. Often it came from contamination, invisible, transferable, and deeply unsettling. Purity was not moral goodness, it was condition. A person could become impure through entirely natural acts: birth, death, sex, menstruation, illness, or contact with certain animals. These states were unavoidable, but they were dangerous because they disrupted the balance between the human and sacred worlds. Purity laws existed to contain this disruption. They dictated who could enter temples, touch sacred objects, or participate in rituals. Someone deemed impure was not sinful, they were unstable. Their presence risked spreading imbalance, much like a sickness spreading through a body. Water was the most common tool of purification. Washing removed ritual contamination, not dirt. Rivers, baths, and sacred basins were thresholds where one state ended and another began. Fire also purified. So did time. Waiting periods allowed impurity to fade naturally, restoring equilibrium. Food taboos reinforced these boundaries. Certain animals were avoided because they blurred categories. Creatures that lived between land and water, animals that ate caring, or beings that behaved unpredictably. Eating was an act of incorporation. Consuming the wrong thing meant internalizing disorder. Purity laws also reinforced social hierarchies. Priests followed stricter rules than common people. Kings were often bound by extreme restrictions, turning their bodies into living sacred objects. Women, especially during reproductive cycles, were frequently labeled impure, reflecting cultural anxiety around fertility, blood, and transformation. Breaking purity laws was not always punished by human courts. The fear was cosmic retaliation, crop failure, illness, divine silence. Communities policed themselves through shame, exclusion, and ritual correction. Confession and cleansing restored belonging. To modernize, these systems appear oppressive or irrational. But for ancient societies, they offered predictability. In a world without scientific explanation, purity laws mapped invisible danger. They explained why misfortune struck and how it could be repaired. Purity was fragile, contamination was constant. Life itself was risky. These laws were not about control alone. They were about survival in a universe believed to be alive, reactive, and easily offended. To remain pure was to remain protected. In many ancient cultures, fertility was not private. It was sacred, dangerous, and essential to survival. Crops, herds, and human communities all depended on successful reproduction, and sexuality was treated as a force that could nourish the world, or unbalance it if mishandled. Fertility rites existed to channel this power. They were timed to seasons, planting cycles, and celestial events. Spring festivals, harvest celebrations, and New Year ceremonies often included explicit sexual symbolism. These rituals were not considered obscene. They were practical acts meant to encourage growth. Sacred prostitution, often misunderstood today, was believed to transfer divine fertility to worshippers or land. The body became an offering, not an indulgence. At the same time, sexuality outside ritual could be heavily restricted. Adultery, uncontrolled desire, or sex at the wrong time was taboo. Sexual energy had to be contained. Too much fertility like too little threatened order. The sacred demanded balance. Objects reinforced this worldview. Phallic symbols, velvets, and exaggerated fertility figurines were common. They appeared in homes, fields, and shrines. These were not pornography. They were protective charms meant to ward off barrenness and death. Women often stood at the center of these rites, revered and controlled at once. Their bodies symbolized continuity, but also instability. Pregnancy, birth, and menstruation placed women at the boundary between worlds. This made them powerful and suspect. Ritual both honored and restricted them. Men participated as well, often through initiation rites that tied sexual maturity to social responsibility. Fertility was never purely biological, it was political. Producing heirs stabilized power. Producing surplus fed cities. It was one of its expressions. Pleasure and danger coexisted. Fertility rituals celebrated life precisely because it was fragile. To misuse sexuality was to offend the gods. To ritualize it was to keep the world turning. Eating was never just nourishment in ancient cultures. It was ritual boundary and risk. Sacred feasts existed to regulate consumption, transforming an everyday act into a controlled encounter with the divine. What was eaten, when it was eaten, and who was allowed to eat all mattered. Sacred meals often followed sacrifice, The offering was divided carefully. A portion for the gods, a portion for priests, and a portion for the community. This division reinforced cosmic hierarchy. Humans did not consume freely, they ate by permission. Sharing food with the divine created temporary communion without collapsing the sacred boundary. These feasts were timed precisely. Festivals marked seasonal shifts, harvests, or victories. Eating at the wrong moment could be dangerous. Fasting periods heightened anticipation, sharpening the contrast between deprivation and abundance. Hunger prepared the body for sacred contact. Rules governed participation. Certain people were excluded. The ritually impure, the uninitiated, foreigners, or those in mourning. Food was power. Allowing someone to eat was allowing them to belong. Exclusion was not merely symbolic. It reinforced social order. Specific foods carried meaning. Bread, wine, meat, and grain represented stability and life. Rare foods signaled divine favor. Some animals were reserved for ritual consumption only. Others were forbidden entirely, associated with chaos, death, or boundary crossing. Eating them risked absorbing their nature. The act of eating itself was monitored. Silence, prayer, or prescribed speech accompanied meals. Leftovers were treated carefully, sometimes burned or buried to prevent misuse. Sacred food could not return to ordinary circulation without losing control. Feasts also reinforce memory. By repeating the same meals annually, communities reenacted mythic time. Eating became storytelling. Each bite recalled origins, covenants, and divine intervention. The past was ingested and made present, yet excess lurked close. Overindulgence, drunkenness, or greed threatened to collapse the ritual. Many myths warn of feasts that turned disastrous when restraint failed. Sacred abundance could quickly become profane chaos. These rituals reveal a worldview that distrusted appetite. Desire needed structure. Consumption required limits. Sacred feasts did not celebrate hunger satisfied. They celebrated hunger disciplined. To eat correctly was to remain aligned with the cosmos. In ancient cultures, the body was not born complete. It had to be shaped, marked, and tested before it could fully belong to society. Initiation rituals served this purpose. They transformed individuals by crossing them through pain, fear, and separation, drawing a clear line between the unformed and the sacred. Initiation marked transitions, childhood to adulthood, outsider to insider, ordinary person to ritual specialist. These moments were dangerous. Crossing thresholds always was. Rituals surrounded them with strict rules to control risk and meaning. Pain played a central role. Scarification, tattooing, circumcision, tooth removal, fasting, or endurance trials were common. Pain proved readiness. Enduring it demonstrated discipline and obedience. The body learned its limits and its value. Secrecy reinforced the sacred. Initiates were often removed from their communities, taken into forests, deserts, or hidden structures. They were stripped of names, clothing, and identity. Isolation created vulnerability. Instruction followed. Knowledge was given slowly, sometimes through symbolic violence or deliberate confusion. The return was ceremonial. The initiate emerged marked and changed. Scars were visible proof of belonging. They signaled that the body itself now carried sacred memory. These marks were permanent. Initiation could not be undone. Not everyone passed. Failure brought shame or exclusion. This reinforced hierarchy. Sacred knowledge was not universal. It had to be earned. Initiation controlled access to power, whether religious, martial, or social. Women underwent their own initiations, often tied to menstruation, marriage, or childbirth. These rites framed biological change as sacred danger. The body was honored but controlled. Transformation required supervision. Initiation rituals reveal a worldview that distrusted ease. Meaning came from ordeal. A body untouched by a ritual was incomplete, unprotected, and potentially dangerous. The sacred body was not gentle. It was disciplined, scarred, and bound by memory. Through pain, individuals learned where they belonged and what they owed. The line between sacred and profane was written into flesh. In ancient cultures, death did not end a person's influence, it intensified it. The dead were powerful, unpredictable, and potentially hostile if mishandled. Death taboos existed to contain this danger and to prevent the living from being pulled across the boundary too soon. Contact with the dead was almost always polluting. Touching a corpse, entering a burial space, or even speaking a dead person's name could trigger ritual contamination. This was not fear of decay, it was fear of proximity to another realm. The dead belonged elsewhere, and careless contact threatened to blur worlds. Funerary rituals existed to manage this transition. Bodies were washed, dressed, bound, or burned according to strict rules. These acts were not symbolic kindness, they were protective measures. Improper burial risked restless spirits, illness, or disaster. A dead body left unattended was a problem for the entire community. Mourning itself was regulated. Excessive grief could attract the dead back toward the living. Too little grief suggested disrespect, provoking anger. Time limits were imposed, clothing, behavior, and speech were controlled. Grief had to be expressed, but not indulged. Spaces associated with death were dangerous. Graves, battlefields, and execution sites were avoided or ritually neutralized. Houses where someone died might be purified or abandoned. The boundary had to be restored before life could continue safely. Ancestors occupied an ambiguous position. They were dead, but necessary. Properly honored ancestors protected households and lands. Neglected ones punished descendants. Offerings, prayers, and periodic feasts maintained this relationship. Death was not erased, it was managed. Certain people worked closer to death than others. Priests, embalmers, grave diggers, and executioners often lived at the edges of society. Their proximity granted power, but carried stigma. They crossed boundaries so others did not have to. These taboos reveal a worldview that treated death as active. The dead were not memories, they were forces. Ritual created distance without severing connection. To respect death was to survive it. To ignore its rules was to invite it back into the living world. Every system of ritual and taboo required enforcement. Boundaries meant nothing without consequences. In ancient cultures, transgression was not simply rule-breaking. It was a threat to cosmic order, and punishment was often framed as sacred necessity rather than human choice. When taboos were violated, the response was rarely proportional in a modern sense. Small acts could provoke extreme reactions because the danger was invisible and collective. One person's impurity might anger the gods, dry up rivers, or invite disease. Punishment protected the many by isolating or eliminating the one. Exile was common. Removing the offender restored balance by distancing contamination. The banished person carried the disorder away from the community. In some cultures, this was temporary. In others, it was permanent social death. Public punishment reinforced the boundary. Executions, mutilations, or ritual humiliation served as warnings. These acts were often performed in sacred spaces or on significant dates, tying justice directly to divine will. Violence became ritualized, framed as cleansing rather than cruelty. Sacrificial punishment blurred lines. Criminals, captives, or social outcasts could be offered to gods as restitution. Their deaths repaired imbalance caused by their own transgression or by communal failure. Justice and sacrifice merged. Not all punishment was physical. Silence, shunning, and ritual denial were powerful tools. Being excluded from feasts, ceremonies, or burial rites meant losing protection. The individual remained alive, but spiritually exposed. Importantly, enforcement was uneven. Elites often faced different rules than common people. Priests and kings could violate taboos with fewer consequences justified by their sacred status. Power altered purity. These practices reveal a worldview where order outweighed mercy. The sacred demanded maintenance. Violence, when ritualized, became acceptable if it restored balance. Transgression was not forgiven easily because it was never private. It endangered everyone. Punishment was not revenge, it was repair. Sacred violence existed to remind societies where the line lay and what happened when it was crossed. For ancient cultures, ritual and taboo were not occasional performances. They were the architecture of everyday life. People did not step in and out of the sacred at will. They lived inside a system where every action carried potential consequence and every mistake risked imbalance. The boundary between sacred and profane was not meant to disappear. It was meant to be maintained constantly. Ritual did not eliminate danger. It managed it. Taboos did not remove desire. They restrained it. Together they created a framework that made an unpredictable world feel navigable. What modern observers often label superstition was for ancient societies practical knowledge. When crops failed, when illness spread, when war erupted, ritual provided explanation and response. It told people what had gone wrong and how to fix it. The sacred was not abstract belief, it was an operating system. Living within this framework required vigilance. People monitored their bodies, their speech, their timing. They learned when to abstain and when to participate, when to approach and when to withdraw. Ignorance was dangerous, knowledge was protection. Importantly, ritual and taboo were not static. They evolved with political change, environmental stress, and cultural contact. New gods were absorbed, old taboos softened or hardened. What remained constant was the need for boundaries. Without them, chaos loomed. These systems also reinforced power. Those who controlled ritual controlled access to safety, belonging, and meaning. Priests, kings, and elders acted as gatekeepers between worlds. Their authority rested not only on force, but on interpretation. They decided what was sacred, what was polluted, and what had to be done. Yet ritual also offered comfort. It gave people a role in survival. Through sacrifice, fasting, mourning, and celebration, individuals participated in maintaining the cosmos. Life felt purposeful even when it was harsh. In the end, ritual and taboo reveal how ancient societies understood existence itself. The world was alive, reactive, and easily disrupted. Humans were not masters of it, but participants bound by rules older than memory. To live was to balance constantly between danger and protection. To cross the line blindly was to invite disaster. To honor it was to endure. The sacred and the profane were never separate realms. They were intertwined and everyone walked the line every day. Zenobia rose from a city that was never meant to produce an empress. Palmyra stood at the edge of worlds, a desert oasis turned mercantile powerhouse where caravans from Persia, Arabia, and Rome exchanged silk, spices, silver, and ideas. Palmyra survived by balance. It spoke many languages, worshipped many gods, and pledged loyalty to Rome while remaining fiercely local. Zenobia was shaped by this environment long before she ruled it. Born around the middle of the 3rd century, Zenobia entered a world already in crisis. The Roman Empire was stretched thin, its emperors rising and falling at alarming speed. In the East, stability depended less on Rome's distant authority and more on strong regional leaders. Palmyra prospered because it understood this reality, and Zenobia learned it early. Ancient sources describe her as highly educated, fluent in Greek, Aramaic, and Egyptian, and comfortable with Latin. This mattered. Language was power. It allowed her to move between cultures without appearing foreign to any of them. She read history, philosophy, and rhetoric not as ornament, but as preparation. Knowledge was armor. Zenobia was also deeply conscious of ancestry. She claimed descent from Cleopatra of Egypt, from the Ptolemies, and from ancient Near Eastern royalty. Modern historians debate these claims, but accuracy mattered less than effect. In a world obsessed with legitimacy, lineage was a weapon. By tying herself to both Hellenistic queens and Eastern dynasties, Zenobia positioned herself as more than a provincial noblewoman. She was presenting herself as a natural ruler. Palmyra itself reinforced this vision. Its monumental colonnades, temples, and tombs reflected wealth and confidence. Unlike Rome's marble dominance, Palmyra projected endurance, a city built to survive empires rather than serve them. Zenobia absorbed this mindset. She did not grow up dreaming of submission. Even before power came to her, Zenobia embodied contradiction. Roman in education, Eastern in identity, scholarly yet physically disciplined, culturally flexible, but politically rigid. She rode horses, trained with weapons, and accompanied military campaigns, not as spectacle, but as presence. This was not the beginning of rebellion, it was the preparation for it. Zenobia did not emerge suddenly in crisis. She was built slowly, deliberately by a city that understood how fragile empires truly were, and Palmyra would soon test Rome's limits through her. Zenobia's rise accelerated through marriage, but it did not begin there. Her union with Odenathus, the most powerful man in Rome's eastern provinces, placed her beside authority at a moment when the Roman world was coming apart. This was not a decorative marriage, it was strategic, forged in an age when emperors were weak and borders were bleeding. Odenathus ruled Palmyra as a client king of Rome, but in practice, he operated as an independent warlord. While Rome struggled with invasions, coups, and short-lived emperors, he defended the eastern frontier against Persian expansion. Rome needed him. He knew it. Zenobia understood it immediately. Unlike many royal wives, Zenobia was not confined to ceremony. Ancient accounts suggest she accompanied Odenathus on campaigns, rode alongside troops, and remained visible in military contexts. This mattered. Soldiers learned to recognize her presence. Commanders learned to respect her voice. She was not hidden behind power. She was embedded within it. At court, Zenobia cultivated influence carefully. She surrounded herself with philosophers, jurists, and administrators fluent in both Roman law and Eastern tradition. Governance in Palmyra required translation, cultural, legal, and political. Zenobia excelled at this role. She observed how Rome rewarded loyalty and punished independence. She also observed how thin Rome's reach had become. The marriage produced a son, Verbalathus, securing dynastic continuity. This would later prove critical. Zenobia was not merely a consort. She was a mother of an heir, a fact that transformed her political weight. In the Roman world, succession was chaos. In Palmyra, Zenobia intended order. The turning point came with assassination. Odenathus was murdered under unclear circumstances, likely by a relative. Power vacuum followed immediately. Rome was too distant, too distracted to intervene decisively. Palmyra stood exposed. Zenobia moved faster than anyone expected. She declared herself regent for her young son, assuming control of Palmyra's armies, treasury, and administration. This was a gamble. A woman ruling in her own name would provoke suspicion. So Zenobia ruled in her son's name and in Rome's shadow, at least at first. What followed was not rebellion born of ambition, but consolidation born of necessity. Zenobia did not seize power because she wanted to challenge Rome. She seized it because Palmyra could not survive without decisive leadership. Rome had failed to protect the East. Zenobia was about to prove she could. With Odenathus dead, Zenobia stood at a dangerous crossroads. Palmyra's survival depended on swift authority, yet her position was fragile. She was a woman, a widow, and the mother of a child ruler in a world that respected strength above all else. Zenobia understood that hesitation would invite collapse. She declared herself regent for her son Valathus, framing her authority as temporary and protective. This choice was calculated. Rule in a child's name softened resistance while preserving control. It allowed Zenobia to command armies and issue decrees without openly violating Roman expectations, at least on paper. Publicly, she maintained loyalty to Rome. Coins were struck bearing the emperor's image alongside her son's. Official documents referred to Valathus as subordinate to imperial authority. This was diplomacy by design. Zenobia was buying time. Privately, she strengthened Palmyra's independence. She secured trade routes, fortified cities, and reorganized administration to reduce reliance on Roman oversight. Taxes flowed into Palmine coffers rather than westward. The army answered to her. Zenobia's court became a center of intellectual life. Philosophers, jurists, and theologians debated under her patronage. This was not indulgence, it signaled legitimacy. Rulers who surrounded themselves with scholars appeared civilized, lawful, and destined to rule. Zenobia styled herself not as a barbarian queen, but as a philosopher ruler in the Hellenistic tradition. Her military strategy was equally careful. She avoided direct confrontation with Rome while expanding Palmyra's influence into vulnerable territories. Roman governors were weak. Provincial cities were neglected. Zenobia offered protection, stability, and lower taxes. Many accepted willingly. Motherhood reinforced her image. She was not an ambitious user. She was a guardian preserving her son's inheritance. This narrative mattered. It framed her expansion as defense, not rebellion. Yet beneath restraint lay ambition sharpened by opportunity. Rome was fractured. Emperors rose and fell. The East was effectively on its own. Zenobia recognized the moment. Regency was not a pause in her rise. It was the method. By ruling cautiously, she built something durable. By appearing loyal, she avoided premature destruction. By waiting, she prepared to act when Rome could no longer ignore her. Zenobia was no longer merely surviving imperial weakness. She was positioning herself to exploit it. Zenobia's true break from Roman control did not begin with a declaration. It began with movement. Armies marched, governors were replaced, and borders quietly shifted. This was expansion carried out under the language of order, not rebellion. The first major target was Egypt. Control of the Nile meant control of grain, and grain meant leverage over Rome itself. Egypt had long been unstable. Its Roman administration weakened by internal strife. Zenobia moved decisively. Palmyrean forces entered, defeated the Roman prefect, and secured Alexandria. The takeover was swift and deliberate. There was no attempt to disguise what had happened, only a careful explanation of why it was necessary. Egypt, Zenobia claimed, required protection. Dead enemies inspire legends. Living ones can be absorbed. By sparing Zenobia, Rome converted defiance into display, then into silence. She became proof of imperial mercy as much as imperial power. If Zenobia lived in exile, it was a controlled survival. She would have been watched, restricted, and stripped of political relevance. Yet survival itself was a form of victory. She had ruled as an equal to emperors. She had forced Rome to mobilize its full strength. Few challengers could claim the same. Her son disappears from the record, likely absorbed into Roman obscurity. Dynastic continuity ended, but Zenobia's personal legacy endured in a different form. Roman writers could not ignore her intelligence, discipline, or courage. Even hostile accounts acknowledged her education and restraint. She was criticized for ambition, but respected for competence. This uneasy admiration ensured her survival in memory. Zenobia did not die screaming in defeat. She faded into Rome, a conquered queen who refused to be forgotten. In a world where most rebels vanished, Zenobia endured. Zenobia lost her empire, but she escaped the fate reserved for most challengers to Rome. Erasure, what remained after her fall, was not a cautionary footnote, but a figure too complex to dismiss. Zenobia entered history not as a failed rebel, but as a ruler who briefly redefined what power could look like on Rome's margins. Roman historians struggled with her. She did not fit the usual categories. She was not a barbarian warlord. She was educated, disciplined, and fluent in Roman political language. She ruled efficiently. She respected law. She built legitimacy rather than ruling through terror. This made her unsettling. Rome preferred its enemies crude and its victories simple. Later writers emphasized her learning, her restraint, and her personal discipline. They noted that she lived like a philosopher, walked long distances with soldiers, abstained from excess, and governed with deliberation. These details mattered. They frame Zenobia as a ruler, Rome defeated not because she was incompetent, but because Rome could not tolerate rivals. In the Near East, her memory took on a different shape. She became a symbol of regional strength, a reminder that Rome's dominance was not inevitable. Palmyra's ruins preserved her presence more powerfully than any inscription. The city itself became her monument, a testament to how close autonomy once came. In later centuries, Zenobia was reinvented repeatedly. Renaissance writers admired her as a classical heroine. Enlightenment thinkers praised her intellect. Modern historians see her as a product of imperial crisis, exploiting opportunity with rare skill. Each era reshaped her, but none erased her. What makes Zenobia endure is not that she rebelled, but how she rebelled. She did not reject Roman civilization. She mastered it. She used its language, symbols, and systems to build something parallel. That was her greatest threat. Zenobia proved that empires can fracture not only through invasion, but through competence elsewhere. She exposed how much Roman power depended on perception, not permanence. Her fall was dramatic. Her survival was remarkable, but her true legacy lies in the brief moment when Palmyra stood as an alternative center of order, ruled by a woman who understood both the empire she challenged and the world beyond it. Rome reclaimed its territory. History kept Zenobia,